Okay, then we're actually moving to theme 5. Would that be okay? Okay, thank you. Theme 5, the Israel-Iran conflict and the role of the United States. This session explores the strategic implications and ripple effects of the Israel-Iran confrontation, including the U.S. role and broader regional stability. So we are joined by 2 leading experts on regional diplomacy and strategic security. Dr. Dina Esfandiary and Dr. Farzan Sabet. Thank you. So, Dr. Dina Esfandiary, would you like to start?
Happy to. I've been asked to give you a little bit of the lay of the land post 12-day war in July, and then look a little bit at the role of the US in light of everything that's happened. So the first thing to say is that if we're talking about a return to diplomacy post-war, you have to look a little bit from how things look from Tehran's perspective. And from Tehran's perspective, they're really stuck between a rock and a hard place right now. They were already engaged in negotiations when the war began, when the attacks began. And so from their perspective, there's an element of lack of understanding. We were engaged in talks, but you're bombing us to get us to return to the negotiating table. That, it doesn't make sense. They also are not known for responding very well to pressure. They never really have responded well to pressure in the past. And again, from their perspective, if they come to the negotiating table after they've been attacked, then it sets a precedent for the future. Anytime that we don't want to talk, attack us, and then we're forced to talk. Again, that's something that in their psyche, they don't want to do. But, and this is why I say they're stuck between a rock and a hard place, they do want to engage on this particular issue because though the system is somewhat split, there is exhaustion when it comes to the nuclear issue. Many of the technocrats that are currently running the country don't want to have to deal with this. They want Iran out of isolation. They want Iran to engage further with the Western world. All of the same reasons that Iran got involved in the nuclear negotiations in the lead up to the 2015 deal. I mean, those reasons are still valid today. The difference today is that they can't be seen to give in. And there is a louder cohort of people inside Iran that are now against diplomacy, that are now more in favor of developing a nuclear weapon. So the way they've navigated it so far in the last month or so since the war is that they've made several small concessions in the sense that they're allowing, or they've had meetings with the IAEA in the last few days. They haven't allowed inspectors back in, but they're holding these meetings to show, okay, we're still willing to talk. I think what's likely to happen, and I'm sure Farzan will go into this, is that they're likely to work with the Europeans to probably extend or accept an extension of the snapback mechanism that is supposed to end in October. And they're likely to return to talks. Well, certainly with the EU, they've already done that. They're likely to continue that. But I think even with the Trump administration, the question is, will those talks lead to anything? I think a couple issues are key to ensure that we do get a resolution of this. The first is that you have to, the US in particular, but even the Europeans have to allow Iran to sell the concessions it's going to make as a win. I mean, it's kind of like an obvious statement to make, but it's an important one. This is even more important in light of the war, because if it can't sell it as a win, then those voices inside Iran that are calling for no deal are just going to get louder and louder. And the public, which was broadly pro-deal and pro-negotiations in the lead up to this war, is also now a bit more split. That sense of nationalism inside Iran, the need to defend itself, the fact that, they've spun it as we were attacked when we were already engaging in talks. I mean, all of those things have to be addressed with whatever deal comes next. I think one easy way to do that is the enrichment issue. I think this is, of course, it was the key issue before the war. It's the key issue today, is whether we're going to be able to have some measure of enrichment on Iranian soil. I think for Tehran, it's key. And again, it's part of that idea of being able to sell the rest of the concessions to their public. And they have demonstrated that they are willing to make significant concessions on the rest of their program. In fact, based on the conversations that I was having with officials that were involved in a lot of these talks, most of the deal had already been hashed out before these strikes. Really the sticking point was the enrichment issue. And it was hard for Iran to know what was going on because the Trump administration was doing a lot of zigzagging at the time. So the problem, which I've alluded to a little bit, is that today Tehran's perspective, the lesson learned from all of this, the takeaway, if you will, is that, well, if we had developed the bomb back then, nobody would have dared attack us on this 12-day war. So while they are keen to, I think, or at least I generalize when I say they, it's obviously split, but while I think the technocrats, the leadership, they're keen to resolve this issue, they also need to hedge now. So I think, and in fact, I think we've seen this in the last few weeks, Iran's program is going to be driven more underground. Everybody talks about these 400 kilograms of enriched uranium that have disappeared. I don't think you're likely to see them appear anytime soon. I think Tehran is going to play on that ambiguity. It is not going to be able to dash for the bomb simply because it knows how penetrated it is. And so any dash for a nuclear weapon would immediately be detected by particularly the Israelis, but I think also Western intelligence. But they also don't need to leave the NPT to do any of this. Leaving the NPT would invite more scrutiny. It'll be a greater headache. It will make Trump crack down on them even more. So they're just likely to continue this ambiguity, stay for now party to the NPT, and have a good rethink about how they're going to maintain this program, what they're going to do, what they're going to rebuild, what they're going to abandon. And it's more of a long-term slog, basically, that we're going to find ourselves. And keep in mind that the American attacks in particular were a real lesson for the Iranians because it taught them, it showed them what the bunker busters can reach and what they can't reach. And I think those are all calculations that they're going to take on board in the reconstruction of the parts of the program that were destroyed. Now, where does the US come in all of this? I think the question you posed me was, where does the US fit basically in regional security? What does it do? Can it contribute to regional security? Well, in terms of the US and the Middle East, I think the Americans are essentially the master puppeteer and the main player in the Middle East. But the United States today is not playing the role that it should play in order to attain both some of its own objectives, but also some of the objectives of the countries in the region, and essentially to get a deal with Iran and to end other regional conflicts. On Iran, there's a real lack of understanding of the Iranian psyche in the US, particularly at the moment. I think there was to a certain extent even under the Biden administration, but it's gotten worse because a lot of the expertise was driven out of the US with the change in administration, and they were scrambling a little bit to bring it back. Obviously, they derailed the talks that they were already engaged in through military action. The perception from the US is that this is going to apply greater pressure to Tehran and ensure that when it comes back, it'll be ready to make the concessions because it will have seen what the US can achieve. Now, that's a fair way of looking at it, but I don't think that's how the Iranians look at it. The Iranians really look at it from a prism of, we can't negotiate from a position of weakness. We can't be seen to give in to concessions, because if we do, it will forever set the scene for the way that we engage with the US in the future. It has also led to some interesting, this is more in US internal politics, but I think these are interesting dynamics to watch inside the US, because there's also a split within Trump's base about whether there was any point in conducting these attacks or not. And so that kind of, the hardcore MAGA supporters were very anti this war against Iran. They didn't appreciate that they were kind of dragged in. I don't think the Trump administration was kept in the loop from the beginning. It was more a question of, oh, they've done that, so let me jump on the bandwagon so I don't look stupid. And And so it's created this split within the base, which I think is something to watch, because for better or worse, Trump still depends on this base for what he plans to do in his country and outside, obviously. Moving away from Iran in the region more generally, I think the Trump administration has obviously made steadfast support for Israel kind of a driving principle. That wasn't as clear at the beginning of his second term, where it seemed like relations between him and Netanyahu were a bit dicey, and that actually he was going to be the one to kind of set the rule and ensure that Netanyahu doesn't go too far. Well, fast forward 6 months, 7 months down the line, and it looks like basically Netanyahu more or less has carte blanche to do what he wants, certainly in Gaza, but now increasingly in the region, because of the successes that Israel has had in the last 2 years, if you can call them that. That means a couple of things for the next little while. The first thing is that there's been an interesting shift amongst countries in the region where Iran was the biggest enemy. And so the question was, what do we do to contain Iran? Well, I think over time, the policy had become we contain it, but we also engage it in order to ensure that we can, foresee any issues that come up with Iran. Today, while they're doing that, they are now increasingly afraid of Israel, because from their perspective, Israel has become the number one problem in the region. And it's almost a greater problem than Iran, because Israel has US backing, which means it's unchecked. And so there's a real fear growing in the Arab world about, it was already there for some of the countries bordering Israel, but increasingly, even those who have normalized with Israel, it's, well, how do we deal with this new element in the region? And then, right, so, and what does this mean for confrontation? And I'll finish here, is I think we haven't seen the end of it. I think there are going to be two main drivers or pushes towards confrontation. The first, as I announced, is Israel being unchecked, which means that its campaign in Gaza is likely to continue to expand, and unless the Trump administration really cracks down, we're unlikely to see an end to that, and all of the consequences that it's likely to have in the region, the spillover into Syria, into Lebanon, etc. And the second layer of confrontation is the one with Iran, which again, I think is likely to continue. A lot of the red lines that we had in place, those unspoken red lines of Iran and Israel striking at each other, the US getting involved directly in a war with Iran, all of those red lines have been blown through in the last few months with relatively little consequence for now. And so the lesson is, well, if we need to teach Iran a lesson, we can do it, and we will do it. And so I anticipate that the Trump administration has set a deadline of end of August for Iran to return to the table, maybe not have a deal. That part of the deadline, I think, wasn't too clear. But I think that between now and likely towards the end of the year, we're likely to see one, if not two rounds of escalation similar to the type that we saw in July.
Thank you very much, Dr. Esfandiary. And it was really penetrating in that you mentioned, like, you addressed the nature of the domestic politics of Iran, like selling consensus as a win, and also like mentioning the strategic ambiguity employed to address the external environments. And please understand that I can't appreciate all the details you mentioned due to NGO neutrality. So hope you understand it. Anyways, so Dr. Sabet?
Yes, thank you very much.
The floor? Yeah.
I think Dina's given an excellent overview of the situation, the evolving regional dynamics, the relationship with the US, and the kind of macro picture of the state of the negotiations. I was asked to address three specific questions. The first relating to the sanctions, second relating to the nuclear issue, and the third relating to kind of non-state actors, and how each of these pieces could link to broader negotiations and kind of options for de-escalation and resolution of the conflict. So the first question I was asked to answer was, how have targeted or sectoral sanctions shaped the strategic balance between Israel and Iran, and how do they affect de-escalation options? So Iran faces one of the most comprehensive and effective sanctions regimes in the post-Cold War era, which has done quite an effective job reshaping the strategic balance between Israel and Iran in favor of Israel in several ways. Broadly speaking, sanctions, especially sanctions that are increasingly comprehensive, have a tendency to impose kind of large inefficiencies on an economy and what in economics they call deadweight loss, right? We did with colleagues at MIT a while back a study on the kind of macroeconomic effects of sanctions, focusing on 10 or 15 key indicators, and trying to figure out the counterfactual effect if those sanctions had not been placed on Iran in the first place, looking at specifically the last roughly 10, 15 years. And we found that the economic effects or the macroeconomic effects were comparable to the effects of the Iran-Iraq war, which lasted for 8 years and was a full-scale conventional war. And in purely monetary terms, inflation adjusted, it was upwards of $1 trillion if we wanted to just put a kind of figure on it. So it imposes a kind of major limitations on an economy, major inefficiencies, and by lowering economic growth and shrinking the size of the economy, it of course means that there's less money for the military, right? So that's kind of the first major impediment in places. It also means that either a loss or more difficult access to high-end supply chains for advanced arms, which means that although the Islamic Republic has done a reasonably good job of developing its own military industrial base and developing various weapons platforms to both defend itself and project power, the quality and quantity of those arms are quite restricted. Just to give one example, Iran's short-range ballistic missiles are known to be quite precise and able to destroy specific buildings and in some cases even smaller targets. But the main weapon that it relies to fight Israel is its medium-range ballistic missiles. And so while these medium-range ballistic missiles are effective as a strategic weapon and as a weapon of terror and in inflicting kind of macro loss, and in some cases can hit large high-value targets as tactical weapons, that is to strike specific military targets, effectively destroy them, especially military targets that are either deeply buried, hardened, in some other way, and defended as a priority type of target by Israel's air defense systems, they're not able to hit those targets. And so what that means is that Israel during the war, given its possession of very advanced arms, was able to destroy a lot of Iran's launchers for missiles, which are kind of fairly small targets. It was able to destroy a lot of the missiles themselves. It was able to target rooms where key officials were sleeping and kill those officials, including one which was 250 meters down from where my cousin lived, right? The very, very pinpoint strikes. Whereas the Islamic Republic was hard pressed to do anything of that nature. And so while Iran's own military capabilities were eroding during the war, by no means destroyed, but certainly eroding, Israel could continue to operate with a fairly high degree of freedom of action. Besides that, I think this imbalance, both in terms of kind of the quality and the quantity of the arms, was reflected in the imbalance and I would say arguably superior performance of Israel in the context of the 12th-day war, effectively decapitating the military leadership of Iran, and according to various estimates, destroying more than 50% of the launchers that it needs to strike Israel, destroying more than 80% of its air defense network, meaning that Israel in the central Iran and the main segments of Iran effectively had air superiority and could do as it pleased, and destroying allegedly 50% or slightly higher of its medium-range ballistic missile stockpile. The sanctions were reflected on that performance. There's also another element, which is that there's a cumulative effect of sanctions when there's underinvestment in a key infrastructure, personnel, and so forth and so on of the country. Meaning that Iran has suffered economic shocks from sanctions. For example, when President Obama imposed them from 2010 onwards, or the reimposition of sanctions under maximum pressure by President Trump. But in 2022, we also saw kind of a new sanctions shock, but wasn't necessarily kind of related to any specific new sanctions measure, but just the cumulative effect of those sanctions over time. And what that means is that the state becomes over time far less resilient and more vulnerable to shocks. And those shocks have included, of course, domestic unrest. So in the Islamic Republic, in the last 16 years, we've had on average once every 4 years, major round of demonstrations against the system. And the last 3 rounds in December 2017, January 2018, November 2019, and September to December 2022, what we've seen a trend of first, the demonstrations becoming larger over time, lasting longer over time, and becoming much more violent and anti-system. And so the Islamic Republic system has been able to manage these demonstrations through repression, but it shows that the kind of loss of resilience, increased vulnerability, especially as it relates to kind of domestic discontent. And somewhere else where we've seen is, for example, in Iran today, there's severe water shortages, and certain municipalities, cities, and provinces are facing water bankruptcy. That's not purely a function of sanctions, but it's exacerbated by sanctions. And the ability to address those issues are, of course, decreased by the imposition of sanctions. The same goes for electricity, power cuts. We now have long periods of power cuts where state institutions, as well as the private sector, is forced to shut down because of these. So broadly speaking, that this has been the effect of sanctions. And of course, Iran's economic vulnerability and need for sanctions relief is a potent form of leverage in the hands of the US and E3 EU in negotiation. But as kind of Dina alluded to, historically with the Islamic Republic, it's shown itself to be insufficient for successful negotiations. That is, you cannot use purely sanctions leverage and pure coercion in order to get what you want in negotiations. There has to be a give and take. And this is a theme we're kind of looking at the Sanctions System Peace Hub right now, where we're looking at the relationship between mediation and sanctions relief as kind of a way to do it. However, increasingly, it seems that many sanctioned governments are not necessarily interested to use sanctions, for example, as a form of behavior change, to restrain certain types of behavior, or even to signal their own norms, which is historically seen as being the kind of main uses of sanctions, but actually to cause gradual state collapse and regime change. Moving to kind of the regional security implications of Iran's nuclear program and which diplomatic or multilateral mechanisms remain viable to address them. I think Dina did a great job, so I'll try to be quite succinct in my points. Before the 12-day war, Iran's nuclear program provided the country with a relatively quick weapons breakout options. That is, an ability to build a nuclear device that it could successfully test and demonstrated that it did have a nuclear weapons capability. And the estimated time for building such a device and conducting a test, depending on the estimate you looked at, was somewhere between 3 to 6 months. In the aftermath of the war, Iran's nuclear threshold status has been reduced, and newer estimates place its ability to break out and build and test a nuclear device as being between 1 to 3 years now, although these are estimates. And given that we're kind of in a post-war scenario where there's a lot of unknowns, it's difficult to get very accurate assessments. Sorry. Specifically thinking about the regional implications of kind of Iran's nuclear program and negotiation, the outcome of US-Iran talks over its nuclear program are very important because it will signal to other countries what capabilities they should be pursuing. And for example, in the case of Saudi Arabia, during President Trump's visit there in May, there was an expectation that there'd be a nuclear deal, and that nuclear deal didn't happen. Part of that, as I understand it, is linked to US demands of severe restrictions on Saudi Arabia's possession of the nuclear fuel cycle, and specifically its ability to enrich uranium. There's probably an element of Saudi Arabia, from what I understand, waiting to see what Iran is able to obtain in negotiations, which would then indicate what its future capability could be, and therefore demanding the same or trying to get the same in the context of its negotiations. And in the case of kind of the signaling from the outcome of US-Iran talks to other countries, it's not only Saudi Arabia, it's Egypt, it's Turkey, and potentially other countries. Furthermore, any Iranian decision to shift away from the ambiguity that Dina highlighted, which is kind of the state that the program has gone into a decision to actually build a bomb, raises the prospect for a nuclear proliferation cascade in the Middle East and North Africa. And so this has been a major overriding concern and attempts to address Iran's nuclear program in the first place, going back to 2002. In terms of negotiations, again, I think Dina addressed it very well. So all I'll say is that in the past, let's say maximalist positions and demands have, like, for example, trying to enforce zero enrichment on Iran, have not proven to be very successful. The cases where we've either had the big deals like the JPOA and the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, or more recently the non-deal that happened over the summer of 2023, which was not very widely acknowledged except in places in the media. There was elements of concession, whether it was sanctions relief, whether that was allowing Iran to retain a certain degree of nuclear capacity, which it could use for peaceful purposes. So the maximalist positions, despite Iran's considerably weakened position, and this arc of weakening is not only a question of the last few months, it's been kind of happening over a longer period, but it hasn't proven successful. There are proposals now for a consortium arrangement, which would have maybe both benefits of placing greater monitoring and restrictions on Iran's ability, while also kind of getting more regional buy-in. And this is something I can address in the Q&A if there's interest, but a form of consortium arrangement where some element of the fuel cycle would remain on Iran's soil has been proposed. There's some interest in Iran, and depending on how negotiations play out, this kind of a consortium arrangement could become relevant. And just to conclude, finally, and I'll try to do it very quickly because I've gone over time, how do Iran's ties with regional non-state actors influence escalation risk, and what non-military tools could help to reduce them? Of course, the axis of resistance, the network of non-state and in the case of Syria, state actors, was meant to provide Iran with both an offensive and defensive, that is, deterrent capability against its adversaries, namely Israel. But of course, in patron-client relationships, the patron does not always able to exert full control or influence over the client. And in the case of Hamas, it appears that it conducted an operation unbeknownst to Tehran in most of its, or at least in its scale, even if Tehran had an idea something was coming, and therefore triggered a war, which has led to the systematic implosion and destruction of Iran's deterrent capability on the nuclear front, to some extent on the missile drone front, and of course on the axis of resistance front. And what we've seen is that, of course, the Bashar al-Assad regime in Syria collapsed. That's completely gone. Hezbollah is seriously degraded as a conventional military actor. Hamas, which had a robust military capability, no longer has those capabilities, and it apparently take years for it to be able to restore that. And of course, the Islamic resistance in Iraq, which was kind of a major network or group with relations with Tehran, which was able to use project power there, is much more paralyzed than it was in the past and unable to act decisively in Tehran's favor. And so as the Islamic Republic now tries to resupply various members of the resistance, including through the Arabian Sea and East Africa, it's going to face new escalation risks. We've already seen this happen. And for the most part, it's been limited strikes by Israel or seizures in the case of the UN with weapons being shipped to the Houthis. But after 7th of October, Israel declared that it might be willing to interpret attacks by the axis of resistance against it as coming from Tehran, and therefore retaliate directly back in Tehran. So although I think the axis of resistance and its non-state network is a much smaller facet of this issue of the broader regional conflicts than it was in the past, it remains a flashpoint and could be a trigger for future rounds of escalation or future rounds of war. Probably the best option for reducing these risks is for these non-state actors first to enter dialogue with them and to eventually move towards either their disarmament or integration into existing armed forces of their countries, with the Islamic Republic agreeing voluntarily to cease military support, although it might choose to continue support for their political arms. And of course, doing so, negotiating those capabilities while it still has it, rather than watching those capabilities be further eroded, further destroyed until it has no leverage. what we've seen until today is that it doesn't appear to be willing to do so, and it believes that it's important for its security to continue support for these groups. Ali Larijani, the new head of the Supreme National Security Council in Iran, is visiting Lebanon, and that's seen to be kind of intended as to signal its continued support for Hezbollah and to kind of try to block the disarmament process there. But I think in the longer term, that we're moving in that direction, and so supporting those processes, I think, would be to the benefit of the region. Thank you.
Dr. Sabet, thank you very much for your refreshing and penetrating analysis. And it was really interesting to hear the sanctions-oriented aspects of the confrontation, and also how it is immensely undermining the country from the economic and social infrastructure level as well.